My name is Alexei, and for 5 years now, I've been working as a taxi driver on the night shift. It's not like this was my childhood dream, but life has a way of steering you down unexpected roads. After my divorce and losing my job at a construction company, I needed a way to make a living and pay alimony. Nighttime taxi driving seemed like a decent option. Fewer traffic jams, higher fares, and I could handle personal matters during the day. Truth is, I barely have any personal matters left, so I spend most of the daylight hours sleeping in my one-room apartment on the city's outskirts. My car is an old but reliable sedan, bought specifically for taxi work. The interior reeks of air freshener, which I hang on the rearview mirror to mask the odors left by passengers. I spend 10, sometimes 12 hours a night behind the wheel, and in that time, dozens of people pass through my car. Most are ordinary folks, heading home from work, parties, or bars. But every now and then, I pick up someone who makes me question whether everything in this world is as straightforward as it seems. The first odd passenger I remember clearly showed up about 6 months into the job. It was an elderly woman who got in around midnight near an old cemetery on the city's northern edge. The location alone was unusual for a taxi call at that hour, but I didn't ask questions. Money is money. She wore a long black coat despite the warm autumn weather, and her face was pale, her eyes unnaturally bright in the dim light of the car's interior. She gave me an address downtown and stayed silent the whole ride, only muttering to herself occasionally. I couldn't make out the words, but the melody felt familiar, like an old lullaby my grandmother used to sing when I was a kid. When we reached her destination, she handed me the exact fare. No tip. The bills were old, worn, and smelled of something strange, like mothballs or church incense. I watched her disappear into the entrance of an old building, and only then noticed a small bouquet of wilted flowers left on the back seat. When I tried to throw them out, they crumbled to dust in my hands. The next strange incident happened in winter. A young guy, maybe 25, got into my car in an industrial area with hardly any residential buildings. He was dressed lightly despite the minus 15-degree weather and kept looking over his shoulder, as if someone was following him. He asked me to drive to the opposite end of the city, but changed the route several times along the way, making me turn into alleys and even drive through a residential courtyard once. The whole trip, he laughed nervously and rambled about playing cards and winning more than he'd planned. He paid with crumpled bills that looked like they'd been stuffed in a pocket for ages and jumped out so fast I didn't have time to give him change. A week later, I saw his picture in the local newspaper. They found him in that same industrial area where he'd gotten into my car. The official story was an accident. He fell from a height. But I remembered his frightened eyes and the way he kept looking back. Maybe he really was running from someone that night, and my car was his last refuge. In spring, I got a regular passenger, a woman around 30 who, every Wednesday at 2 a.m., called a taxi from her home to an old mansion in the city's historic center. The mansion had been empty for years, slated for demolition, but something always delayed it. Lost paperwork, lack of funds. She always wore the same thing, a simple dark dress and a light coat. She never spoke, just nodded in response to my attempts at conversation, and always stared out the window with a sad expression. The trip took about 20 minutes, and she sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap. At the mansion, she'd get out, pay the exact fare, no tip, and disappear behind the rusty gates. I never saw her enter the house itself, and I always drove off without knowing what she was doing there. 2 months later, she stopped calling. When I passed by the mansion, I noticed the gates were now welded shut, and a no entry sign hung on the fence. Being a taxi driver taught me not to ask unnecessary questions or meddle in passengers' lives. People get in your car with all sorts of problems and secrets, and your job is just to get them where they're going. But sometimes, curiosity gets the better of you, especially when you start seeing the same people at the same times in the same places. You notice patterns, build theories, and the more you think, the stranger it all seems. My workday starts at 10 p.m. I leave my apartment, get in the car, and open the ride-hailing app. Early orders usually come from people lingering at work or heading to movies, theaters, or meetups with friends. These are routine trips that leave no lasting impression. The real work begins after midnight, when offices and stores close, but nightclubs and bars come alive. That's when the streets fill with those who prefer darkness to light, silence to noise, and solitude to company. Last summer, I had a regular passenger, a middle-aged man who always booked a ride from his home to the city train station. He traveled with a large black suitcase, which he placed on the back seat next to him and held onto during the ride. The suitcase was heavy. I could tell by how much effort it took him to lift it, but its contents remained a mystery. At the station, he'd get out, take the suitcase, and vanish into the building. An hour or two later, I'd get another order. Same address, same passenger, but without the suitcase. On the way back, he'd stare out the window in silence, looking exhausted. These trips went on for about 2 months until one night he got in without the suitcase. He seemed agitated, constantly looking around, and asked me to drive not to the station, but to the bus terminal on the other side of the city. He drummed his fingers nervously on his knee and urged me to drive faster several times. At the terminal, he threw some money at me and bolted toward the buses. I never saw him again, and a week later, the news reported a police search at his home. They were looking for him on suspicion of smuggling. That black suitcase must have held something illegal. In autumn, things got truly bizarre. One night, an order came from a woman standing at a bus stop in a residential area. When I pulled up, I saw she was dressed lightly for the chilly weather. Short skirt, thin blouse, high heels. Her age was hard to pin down. In the dim streetlight, her face looked young one moment, faded the next. She got in and gave an address in the city center, where the fanciest restaurants and hotels are. On the way, she kept touching up her makeup in a compact mirror, and I noticed her hands trembling. When we reached her destination, a luxurious hotel, she rummaged through her purse for a long time before asking me to wait a few minutes. She said she'd meet someone who'd pay for the ride. I didn't mind. The meter was running, and I didn't care who paid. She got out and walked toward the hotel entrance, but stopped halfway. She stood motionless for about 5 minutes, then turned sharply and hurried back to the car. She got in, slammed the door, and asked me to take her home. She didn't say a word the whole way back, and when we arrived, she admitted she had no money. She asked me to wait while she went upstairs to get cash, and that was the last I saw of her. I waited half an hour, then went up to the apartment. It was empty, not even furniture inside. Neighbors said no one had lived there for months. Stories like these are a regular part of my job. People vanish, don't reach their destinations, leave strange objects in the car, or take things that don't belong to them. I've gotten used to the fact that not all passengers are who they seem at first glance. The night hides countless secrets, and working at this hour, you can't help but witness things that would seem impossible in daylight. One of the most memorable trips happened late last autumn. The call came around 3 a.m. from a young girl standing outside a 24-hour store in a newer residential area. When I pulled up, I noticed she looked very young, 17 or 18 at most. She was dressed simply: jeans, sweater, sneakers. Nothing unusual except for one thing. It was pouring rain, but she was completely dry. Even her hair wasn't wet, despite the 20-meter walk from the store to my car under open sky. She sat in the front seat, which is rare. Most passengers prefer the back. She gave an address in the old part of town, where pre-revolutionary buildings and narrow streets still stand. On the way, she talked about her life, studying at university, living with her parents, working evenings at a cafe. A typical story for a girl her age, but something about it felt off. Her details didn't add up. She'd mention studying psychology, then talk about design courses, then say she wanted to be a doctor. Her workplaces shifted mid-story too. When we reached the address, it was an old tenement building in desperate need of repair. Plaster was peeling, many windows were boarded up, and the entrance hadn't been painted in decades. She paid the exact fare, no extra, and got out. I watched her disappear into the dark doorway, and that's when I noticed something odd. The rain was still pouring, but she walked to the building slowly and the drops seemed to avoid her. I sat in the car for a long time, wondering if I'd imagined it due to fatigue or poor lighting. A few days later, I got another call from the same address. This time, it was an elderly man who looked unwell. Pale face, sunken cheeks, labored breathing. He struggled to get in and asked me to take him to the hospital. On the way, he said he'd lived in that building for 40 years, that it used to be a nice neighborhood, but now most neighbors had moved out, leaving the place nearly empty. Only he and a few other old tenants remained. No young people lived there. The apartments were too old, utilities too worn out, and renovations too costly. His words made me think about that girl. If the building was nearly empty and no young people lived there, what was she doing there? And why didn't the rain touch her? I tried to convince myself I'd made a mistake, but doubts lingered. In my line of work, I'd seen plenty of strange things, but some passengers crossed the line into something beyond human. Winter brought even more inexplicable cases. One night, I got a call from a woman standing at a bus stop in an industrial area. When I arrived, I saw a figure in a long coat, back turned to me. She faced me as I stopped, revealing a woman in her 40s with deeply sad eyes. She sat in the back and asked me to drive to an old cathedral in the city center, long since decommissioned and now a museum. The whole ride, she cried quietly. In the rearview mirror, I saw tears streaming down her face, but there were no sobs, just silent weeping, far more unsettling than loud crying. When we reached the cathedral, she wiped her face with a handkerchief, paid, and got out. I watched her walk to the cathedral's fence and stop by some old gravestones in the churchyard. I drove off, but her silent tears haunted me the rest of the night. A week later, I passed by the same spot and stopped to look at the graveyard in daylight. Among the weathered monuments, I found the one she'd stood by. It bore a photo of the same woman I'd driven, though she looked 20 years younger. The dates showed she'd died 15 years ago. I stood there, searching for a rational explanation, but found none. These incidents started changing my life. Sleep became harder. Even during the day, images of strange passengers haunted me. I had dreams where I drove the same people through dark city streets, but the roads led to unknown places not on any map. I began avoiding certain areas, especially where I'd met the oddest passengers, but orders came from everywhere. And sometimes I had to go exactly where I didn't want to. Alcohol helped dull the anxiety, and I started having a shot before each shift. I told myself it was for courage, to stop thinking about the weirdness in my car every night. But one shot became two, then three, and I realized I was growing dependent. My wife took not just half our belongings in the divorce, but a piece of my soul. And now my job was destroying what was left. My apartment was small and gloomy. The windows faced a courtyard where sunlight barely reached, even on clear days. The furniture was what my wife didn't want. Old, mismatched. A worn sofa served as my bed. The actual bed felt too big for one person. The fridge held little beyond beer and frozen meals. The TV played just to break the silence. The money from taxi work barely covered alimony and living expenses. I saved a little sometimes, but it vanished quickly. Car repairs, winter tires, or drinks at the bar with other lonely men. Life became a cycle. Sleep by day, work by night, a bit of alcohol for courage, and back to sleep. The only thing keeping me going was the hope that this was temporary, that I'd find a better job, meet a good woman, start over. But with each month, that hope faded, and the strange incidents in my taxi grew more frequent and unsettling. I began to realize my job was changing me, making me part of a dark world that existed parallel to normal life, visible only at night. One winter, I noticed some passengers started recognizing me, not just as a driver they'd ridden with before, but as if we'd known each other for years. A young man I picked up at the train station got in and said, "Hey, it's you again. How's life?" I was certain I'd never seen him before. An elderly woman near a hospital asked, "So, has your wife forgiven you yet?" I'd never mentioned my divorce to any passenger. It was too personal. These moments became more common. People I was sure I'd never met spoke to me like old friends, knew details about my life, asked about things I'd never shared. Some gave advice, where to drive for more fares, cheap places to eat at night, which areas to avoid. Their tips were always spot on, as if they knew the city better than I did, despite my years on the job. Gradually, I began to suspect something far more complex than mere coincidences or an overactive imagination. The city at night seemed to live a life of its own, entirely separate from the daytime world. Streets I knew well in daylight looked different in the dark, as if they led to places not found on any map. And the people who got into my car after midnight belonged to this other, nocturnal world, with its own rules and secrets. In spring, events unfolded that convinced me something was deeply wrong with my job. The first major incident happened in April, as the city stirred from a long winter. An order came around 1 a.m. from a man standing near an old, abandoned factory on the city's outskirts. The factory had been shut down for years, its buildings empty, visited only by the homeless seeking shelter in its decaying halls. The man was middle-aged, dressed in a worn suit that might once have been expensive but now looked like he'd slept in it for days. His face was unshaven, his eyes red from exhaustion, or something else. He got in and gave an address in the city center, a regular residential building in a nice area. But a few minutes into the ride, I sensed something was off. He kept glancing out the rear window as if we were being followed, though the road behind us was empty, hardly any traffic at 2 a.m. in that area. He urged me to speed up, then suddenly demanded I slow down or turn into an alley. His behavior grew increasingly erratic, and at one point he started muttering to himself. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone sounded like he was arguing or justifying himself to someone. He'd paused as if listening to a reply, then resumed talking. The car grew colder, despite the heater being on and the warm spring night outside. When we reached his address, he sat in the car for a long time, staring at the building's windows. Finally, he paid. More than the fare, telling me to keep the change. He got out and walked slowly toward the entrance but didn't go in, instead slipping around the corner of the building. I waited a few minutes, then drove off, but his image lingered in my mind. The next day, the news reported a man's body found near that abandoned factory. The official cause was suicide, but I remembered his frightened eyes and nervous demeanor. After that, I started paying closer attention to what happened in my car. I noticed details I'd overlooked before, like how some passengers didn't appear in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was a trick of light and shadow, the city's varying street lights. But I began checking deliberately, and it was true. Some people I could see directly, but not in the mirror. The first such passenger was a girl in her mid-20s who got in near a nightclub downtown. She was dressed brightly, short dress, high heels, lots of jewelry, like a typical club-goer heading home. But when I glanced in the rear-view mirror, the back seat was empty. Yet I heard her voice clearly, smelled her perfume, saw her adjusting herself in the seat. The ride lasted about 20 minutes, and I spent it trying to make sense of what was happening. She chatted about her night at the club, complained about a friend who'd left with some guy, leaving her alone, a conversation I'd heard countless times from other passengers. But there was no reflection. When we arrived, she paid with ordinary money, warm from her hands, with the usual scent of cash. These incidents became more frequent. People got in, acted perfectly normal, but didn't show in the mirror. I tried to rationalize it, lighting, angles, exhaustion, but no logical explanation held up. I began to think I was losing my mind from loneliness and endless night shifts, but the money these invisible passengers paid was real. In summer, an incident made me seriously consider quitting. An order came from a woman at an address not listed on any city map. The navigation system errored out when I tried to find it, but the order was logged in the app, so the address existed in its database. I drove toward the area the app indicated and found the street. The address was an old mansion from the early 20th century, looking abandoned. Peeling paint, shuttered windows, overgrown garden. At the gate stood a woman in a long black dress of an old-fashioned cut. She was beautiful, but her beauty was unnatural. Too perfect. Her skin was pale as porcelain, lips vivid red, eyes dark. Her hair was styled in an elaborate updo from a century ago. She got in and asked me to drive to the old city cemetery. Not the new one, but the historic one downtown where burials stopped long ago. She was silent most of the way, only once asking for music. I turned on the radio, but she shook her head and requested something older. I had a USB drive with classical music for when I needed to unwind, so I played Chopin, and she nodded approvingly. I tried starting a conversation a few times, but she answered curtly or not at all. In the rearview mirror, the back seat was empty, yet her presence was undeniable. The car's scent changed, heavy with old-fashioned perfume, sweet and cloying. At the cemetery, she got out and walked toward the oldest section, where pre-revolutionary monuments stood. Curious, I followed her discreetly. She stopped at a tall marble cross with a photograph of a woman, the same woman I'd just driven. The dates showed she died in 1923. I watched from behind a tree as the figure in black stood by the grave, then slowly dissolved into the air until she was gone. The fare was left in my pocket. Old imperial coins, long out of circulation but valuable to collectors. The next day, I took them to a friend who deals in antiques, and he confirmed they were genuine and very old. I got several times the usual fare for them, After that, I realized I wasn't just a taxi driver. My car had become a ferry between worlds, the living and something else. The people who got into my taxi after midnight weren't always alive in the usual sense. Some had died long ago but lingered in the city for reasons I didn't understand, needing rides to specific places. The fear I felt in the early months of these encounters dulled over time. I got used to the fact that my car carried not just the living, but those who'd crossed into death yet weren't ready to leave this world. Some were dangerous, but most just wanted to finish unfinished business or reach places that mattered to them. I learned to spot these passengers. They shared traits: pale skin, no mirror reflections, odd smells lingering after their rides, and the money they paid, sometimes ancient, sometimes impossibly new. But the main signs were the chill that filled the car when they got in, and the sense that time flowed differently during their trips. My routine shifted further. I no longer just slept by day. I spent hours researching the people I drove at night. I scoured old newspapers in the library, dug through archives, visited cemeteries to read headstones. A picture emerged. Many of my nocturnal passengers were indeed dead, some for decades, yet something tethered them to this world. Alcohol stopped easing the anxiety. It made the visions sharper and more terrifying. I tried finding daytime work, but my taxi skills were niche, and my age and lack of education worked against me. Plus, the money from night shifts was good, especially when passengers paid with antique coins or old bills. By late summer, my night shifts had changed drastically. Where strange passengers were once occasional, they now made up most of my fares. Ordinary people seemed to stop booking taxis after midnight, or my app only assigned me those from the world of shadows and the dead. I no longer flinched at missing reflections, sudden cold in the cabin, or bizarre payments. It was my new normal. But in September, something new and more terrifying began. The passengers weren't just dead. They were malevolent. The first was a man I picked up near an old bridge over the river, closed to traffic after an accident a decade ago. The order came from there. And when I arrived, I saw a figure in a dark cloak standing at the bridge's edge. He got in, and the car's temperature plummeted so sharply I could see my breath. He was tall, gaunt, with long gray hair and eyes that seemed entirely black. His hands were gray, mottled like a corpse's. The smell from him was of decay and dampness, so strong I cracked a window despite the cold. He gave an address in the city center, a luxury residential complex for the wealthy. But minutes into the ride, I knew he was different from the others. He spoke in a voice like metal scraping glass, recounting his death, falling from the bridge into the icy river, drowning slowly. He said no one looked for him because he was homeless, invisible to the world. But what stood out was his hatred. He spoke of loathing the living, especially those with warm homes, families, jobs, money. He wanted to take it all from them, to see them suffer. His words grew more venomous, and a dark, oppressive presence filled the car. The steering wheel turned icy under my hands, and frost formed on the windows from the inside. At the complex, he didn't leave right away. He stared at the lit windows of the apartments, then turned to me. His face had changed, more deathly. Eyes now black voids, yellowed, rotting teeth visible. He reached out to pay, and I saw his fingers ended not in nails but in sharp, black claws. The money he gave was wet and sticky, reeking of blood. After he got out and headed toward a building's entrance, I couldn't move for a long time. My hands shook, my mind racing with the realization I'd just driven something evil to someone's home. The next day, the news reported a resident of that building found frozen to death in his apartment, despite working heat. These malevolent passengers became more common, dead souls filled with hatred, using my taxi to reach their victims. I realized I was no longer just a ferryman between worlds, but an accomplice to something horrific. My car had become a vehicle for those who should have stayed buried, now hunting the living. Refusing these orders didn't work. The app started acting strangely, assigning fares without dispatcher input. Some came from vacant lots or abandoned buildings, but a passenger was always there, waiting for my car specifically. Ignoring orders caused the app to glitch, my phone to die, or the engine to stall. In autumn, an incident convinced me I'd lost control of my life. An order came from a woman at the city hospital. When I arrived, I saw a young girl in hospital clothes standing by the morgue entrance. She was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, moving unnaturally like a puppet on strings. She got in and asked to be taken home, giving an address in a working-class neighborhood of high-rises. On the way, she shared her story. She was 19 when she died in a car accident after days in intensive care. Before dying, she'd fought with her mother over something trivial and now wanted to apologize. Her story seemed touching, and I almost believed I was driving a benign ghost seeking closure. But when we reached her building, she asked me to wait a few minutes while she went to talk to her mother. I agreed. The meter was running, and I didn't mind how long she took. Half an hour passed, then an hour, and she didn't return. Worried, I went up to the apartment she'd mentioned. The door was ajar, and strange sounds came from inside, a mix of crying and laughter. I pushed the door open and stepped in. The apartment was in chaos. Furniture overturned, odd stains on the walls. In the center lay an elderly woman, likely the girl's mother. She was alive but in a bizarre state, eyes rolled back, foaming at the mouth, body convulsing. Beside her stood my passenger, but she looked different. Her hospital clothes were stained dark, her face twisted in a malicious grimace, fingers now long, sharp claws. She turned to me, her eyes glowing red in the dim light. She smiled, revealing needle-sharp teeth, and said in a voice no longer human, "Thanks for the ride. I've wanted to come home for so long." Then she laughed, a sound so horrific it deafened me, my throat dry with fear. I fled the apartment, racing downstairs and driving off without looking back. My hands shook so badly I could barely steer the rest of the night. The next day, the news reported the elderly woman's death in that neighborhood. The official cause was a heart attack, but neighbors spoke of screams and eerie noises from the apartment all night. After that, I knew I couldn't keep driving, but quitting proved impossible. The app wouldn't let me delete my profile. The dispatch company claimed no one with my name worked for them, and my car wouldn't start unless I activated passenger search mode. I was trapped. My apartment became a place to endure daylight hours between nightly horrors. Sleep was elusive, and when it came, dreams brought images of dead passengers, angry, hateful faces. Sometimes I dreamed of the aftermath of my trips, ruined families, dead people whose souls were claimed by those I'd driven to their homes. Alcohol no longer dulled the terror. It sharpened the visions, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. I tried seeing a doctor, but how do you explain you drive a taxi for the dead? How do you describe a car that's become a tool for evil, ferrying ghosts and demons to hunt the living? The money I earned grew stranger. Sometimes it was normal cash, but often it was something else. Ancient coins that crumbled to dust days later, banknotes with non-existent serial numbers, bills smelling of graves or stained with blood-like marks. When I tried spending them, shopkeepers gave me odd looks, as if seeing something I couldn't. I started noticing changes in myself. My skin paled, my eyes dulled, and my reflection in mirrors sometimes looked blurry, as if I were becoming a ghost. food lost its taste, and touching everyday objects felt wrong, like a film separated me from reality. The worst part was that I began to enjoy the work. When an especially malevolent dead passenger got in, knowing I was driving them to a victim, a strange feeling stirred in my chest. Not joy, but something like satisfaction. As if I were part of something bigger, fulfilling a purpose. These thoughts scared me more than anything, signaling I was no longer fully human. Winter brought new horrors. Passengers grew crueler, their stories more terrifying. Now, I drove not just the dead, but those who died violently and craved revenge. Murder victims, the tortured, suicides, they all sought to harm the living, and I was their conduit. One of the worst was a woman I picked up near an abandoned factory on the city's outskirts. She said her husband killed her 10 years ago, burning her body in the factory's furnace. Now she wanted to visit him. He lived in the same house, had a new family, and no one knew of his crime. She described what she'd do to him, her words chilling my blood. When we reached his house, she got out and vanished into the air before my eyes. Moments later, screams came from the house. Men, women, children. They went on for a long time, then silence. I drove away, knowing I'd witnessed and enabled something horrific but powerless to stop it. My life became an endless nightmare with no waking. By day, I tried to escape in sleep, but even dreams brought my passengers' faces. By night, I worked, knowing each trip could be my last. Not for the dead passengers, but for me, losing my humanity and merging with the dark world parallel to reality. Spring brought no relief. On the contrary, with the arrival of warmth, the activity of the dead intensified. Orders now came not only at night, but also in the pre-dawn hours, when the boundary between worlds grew especially thin. I no longer slept. Even with my eyes closed, I saw the faces of my passengers, heard their voices, felt the chill of their presence. My car changed. The interior stayed cold even in warm weather, the seat upholstery darkened with inexplicable stains, and the smell of death seeped so deeply that no air freshener could mask it. The mirrors cracked without being touched, and the radio turned on by itself, tuning to frequencies with strange voices and unfamiliar music. The most terrifying part was that I began recognizing some passengers, not because they'd ridden with me before, but because I'd seen them in the news as victims. The woman I drove to her ex-husband's house was reported missing 10 years ago. The young man who asked to be driven from the bridge was found in the river a week after our trip, though I knew he'd drowned long before. Gradually, I realized a horrifying truth. The dead weren't just using my services. They were pulling me into their world, making me part of their existence. Each trip erased another piece of my humanity, bringing me closer to the moment when I'd cease to be alive and become one of them. One April night, an event made me understand how little time I had left. An order came from a passenger waiting outside my own apartment building. When I pulled up, I saw myself, a perfect copy, but paler, with empty eyes and a strange smile. My doppelganger got in and asked to be driven back to my own building. "You'll understand soon," he said in a voice like mine, but echoing as if from a deep cave. "Soon, you'll be one of us, and I'll take your place. The living shouldn't meddle in our affairs for too long. It changes them, corrupts them, makes them unfit for normal life." The whole ride, my doppelganger explained how the system worked. There are people who become conduits between worlds. Taxi drivers, bus drivers, ferrymen. They help the dead move, finish unfinished business, settle scores with the living. But the price is their soul. Over time, The conduit loses touch with the living world and becomes a ghost like those they drove. And someone new takes your place, he continued. Someone desperate, lonely, willing to take any job for money. The system has worked for centuries, and you're just another link in the chain. When we reached my building, my doppelganger didn't pay. He got out, walked to the entrance, and used keys to my apartment. He knew the intercom code. He went upstairs as if he'd lived there his whole life. I sat in the car, realizing that place was no longer my home. That day, I made a decision that had been brewing for months. I had to break the chain, stop the system that turned desperate people into farriers for the dead. But it required one final trip, the most important and dangerous. I drove to where it all began. The taxi dispatch office that hired me 5 years ago. The building was older than I remembered, and the office wasn't on the first floor anymore, but in the basement. Descending, I found a long corridor lined with doors, behind which came voices, not human, but like whispering wind or creaking old wood. The door with the number I recalled was open. Behind the desk sat the same woman who'd hired me, but now I saw her true face. Gray, corpse-like skin, eyes like black voids, a smile of rotting teeth. The walls were covered with photos, hundreds of faces of drivers who'd worked for the dead. Some were ancient, others recent. My photo hung in the center, and I noticed with horror that my face was already changing, becoming more deathly. "Here for your paycheck?" she asked, her voice like grave dirt falling on a coffin lid. "Or to extend your contract? You're doing well. The clients are pleased." I stayed silent, taking in the office. In the corner stood antique meters like the one in my car, rusted and covered in cobwebs. Shelves held folders with crumbling papers and faded ink. The phones were old rotary models, and when one rang, it sounded like a dying scream. "I want to quit," I said finally. She laughed, the sound echoing down the corridor. "No one quits this job," she replied. "You can only cross to the other side. Become a client instead of a driver. Want to try?" That's when I knew what I had to do. The only way to stop the system was to destroy what sustained it. I pulled a gas can from my pocket, one I'd taken from the car, and began dousing the office. The woman watched with surprise but didn't stop me. "You think fire will help?" she asked. "We don't exist in your world, boy. You can't destroy us with physical means." But I lit a match and dropped it. The fire erupted instantly, consuming documents, photos, old furniture. The woman screamed, a nearly human sound for the first time, and tried to escape. But the flames surrounded her, and she began to dissolve like smoke. "You don't know what you're doing," she shrieked, growing transparent. "Without us, they'll be trapped between worlds. They'll suffer forever." I ran from the burning building and got into my car. The engine started one last time, and I drove to where it all began, the old bridge where the worst trip started. Behind me, the fire roared, and in the rear-view mirror, I saw flames rising to the sky, carrying the screams and moans of those trapped in that underground office. At the bridge, a crowd waited. All my former passengers standing in a row, dead, angry, full of hatred. They knew I destroyed the system that let them return to the living world. Now they were trapped between life and death, unable to live or fully die. "You'll pay for this," said the man I'd driven first among the malevolent dead. "We'll take you with us. You'll suffer with us." But I'd made my choice. I started the car one last time and aimed it at the bridge's edge. The meter on the dashboard showed an amount I could never pay. A debt for all those killed by my passengers, for families destroyed, souls ruined. In the final moment before the fall, I saw my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was nearly transparent, eyes empty, skin gray. I was barely human anymore, but I still had a choice. to end this as a living person or become another vengeful ghost. The car plunged into the river, and icy water filled the cabin instantly. In my final seconds, I felt something strange. Relief. For the first time in months, the car held no smell of death, no cold, no presence of foreign souls. Just me, and a silence I hadn't known in ages. The water closed over my head and I saw the ghosts on the bridge dissolve into the morning mist. The system was destroyed, the chain broken. There would be no more drivers for the dead, no more nocturnal passengers using taxis as bridges between worlds. My last conscious memory was a ray of sunlight piercing the water. In it, I saw the faces of those I'd saved by my death. People who might have been the next victims, the next drivers, the next links in an endless chain of suffering. When rescuers found my car at the river's bottom, they couldn't explain certain oddities. The meter showed an astronomical sum, though it was off. The back seat held ancient coins and bills that crumbled to dust when touched. In the glove compartment, they found a notebook with addresses of non-existent places and names of people long dead. The dispatch service I worked for vanished. The building where the office had been was empty for years, and locals swore no taxi service ever operated there. My app profile deleted itself, and my trip history erased from the database. Most importantly, nighttime orders in the city stopped. Night shift taxi drivers noticed fewer passengers after midnight, and those who did ride were ordinary living people. No one vanished without a trace, left strange objects, or paid with coins that turned to dust. I paid the ultimate price, my life, to sever the connection between worlds. The system that turned desperate people into farriers for the dead was gone. The ghosts who used night taxis to hunt the living vanished forever. Sometimes, on the darkest nights, a car's silhouette appears on the old bridge. But it's not a threat. It's a reminder that the boundary between life and death must remain impassable, and the dead must stay dead, not meddling in the affairs of the living. My story is over, but the city is safer, and that's the only thing that mattered.